In the high desert benches above the Yakima River, every orchard in the valley was irrigated the same way, and had been for 60 years. This was not a decision anyone made. It was inheritance. Overhead sprinklers in the early years, then microjets and drip lines running down every row like veins under skin, feeding water to root zones that had long since stopped knowing how to find water on their own. Nobody in Yakima County had planted a tree in 100 years and simply let it learn to reach. The valley grew the best apples in America because the valley told the trees exactly what to do and when to do it, and the trees said, and the growers cashed their checks in September, and that was the order of things. The idea that a tree might be better off doing some of the work itself was not a controversial idea in Selah, Washington. It was not even an idea. Nobody had bothered to disagree with it because nobody had bothered to say it out loud. The Barron's orchard sat on 62 acres on a bench above Cowwitch Creek, the kind of ground that got morning sun and afternoon wind, and it had been in the family since 1951, when a man named Otto Barron's had planted the first block of wine saps on land that was mostly sagebrush and rock. His grandson, Walton Barron's, had taken it over in 1988 and had spent 30-some years pulling out old varieties and putting in new ones, chasing the market the way every orchardist in the valley chased the market, from Red Delicious to Gala to Honeycrisp, always one step behind whatever the co-op said would sell. Walton was not a careless man. He kept his irrigation logs in a black binder that lived on the kitchen counter, and he knew his bins per acre going back to the Clinton administration, and he ran a tight, profitable operation right up until the morning in April of 2015, when his heart stopped in the equipment shed and his wife found him there an hour later. With a wrench still in his hand, his wife's name was Odessa Barron's, and she is the reason this story exists. Let me tell you about Odessa, because she is not who you are picturing. She was 51 years old the spring Walton died, and she had not spent her life waiting in the farmhouse kitchen. For 22 years, Odessa had worked as a soil conservation technician for the Natural Resources Conservation Service, driving a government pickup truck across 3 counties, testing infiltration rates and organic matter percentages on other people's ground, writing up nutrient management plans that mostly sat in filing cabinets and were mostly ignored. She had a soil science degree from Washington State that she had earned at night while raising 2 children, and she had spent 2 decades quietly, becoming one of the most knowledgeable people in the region about what was actually happening 6 inches under the surface of Yakima County dirt. And she had spent that same 2 decades married to a man who ran his own 62 acres the way his father had, because that was Walton's ground and Walton's decision. And Odessa had made her peace with that a long time ago. She had never once told him he was doing it wrong. She had simply gone to work every day and tested other people's soil and come home and cooked dinner and kept her binder of research to herself. That changed the morning she found him in the shed. It took her almost a year to decide anything. She kept the crew on, kept the trees pruned and picked, kept selling to the same packing house Walton had always sold to. But somewhere in that first winter, sitting at the kitchen table with Walton's black irrigation binder, open in front of her next to her own decades of notes, she started doing arithmetic she had never let herself do out loud. The Barron's orchard was irrigated at roughly the same rate as every other orchard on the bench, and it was showing the same signs she had been documenting on other people's ground for 22 years without saying anything. Falling organic matter, compacting subsoil, root systems that had gotten lazy and shallow because the water always came from above, on a schedule, whether the tree asked for it or not. She had watched this pattern for 2 decades in fields that belonged to strangers. Now she was looking at it in her own dirt, under trees her husband had planted, and for the first time in her life she let herself think the sentence all the way through. This ground could be doing better than this. Let me tell you about the science, because you need to understand what Odessa understood before you can understand what she did next. Healthy orchard soil is not dirt, it is closer to an organ, a living structure of fungal threads and bacterial colonies and earthworm channels that together determine whether water that falls on the surface sinks in and stays or runs off and is gone. The mycorrhizal fungi that colonize apple tree roots extend a tree's effective reach for both water and phosphorus by a factor that conventional drip irrigation, delivered in small, precise doses right at the trunk, does almost nothing to encourage. When a tree is watered on a schedule at the base, it has no reason to send roots out searching. It becomes, in the phrase Odessa had read a dozen times in extension bulletins and finally believed, agronomically dependent. Add to that the compaction from decades of tractor and sprayer passes down the same wheel tracks and the near total absence of organic matter between rows that were kept bare and sprayed clean of every weed, and you had an orchard sitting on soil that had less capacity every year to hold water, hold nutrients, or support the biology that made an apple tree resilient instead of merely productive. Odessa had seen the alternative on paper for years. Dry-farmed and reduced irrigation orchard systems in other apple-growing regions, parts of eastern Oregon, some of the older dryland ground in the Wenatchee Hills, where growers had let deep-rooted perennial ground cover grow between the rows instead of bare dirt, mulched heavily under the trees with wood chips and compost instead of spraying the ground clean, and cut irrigation by a third to a half over several years, forcing the trees to root down instead of staying shallow and soft. The yields in the research trials she'd read were not dramatically higher in a normal year. Sometimes they were slightly lower. But the trees were different underneath, more resilient, better able to survive stress. And Yakima County, sitting in a valley that got maybe 8 inches of rain a year and depended entirely on snowpack and irrigation canals that were increasingly unreliable as the summers got hotter, was exactly the kind of place where resilience was going to matter more than a marginal yield bump, sooner or later. She brought it up with her orchard foreman on a Tuesday afternoon in March of 2016, standing at the edge of the oldest block, the 11 acres of aging wineslip and Rome that Walton had always meant to pull out and never gotten around to. His name was Emmett Kowalczyk, and he had worked the Barrens ground for 19 years, first for Walton and now for her, and he was the kind of man who said very little and noticed everything. "I want to try something different on the old block," she told him. Emmett looked at the trees. Old winesaps nobody much wanted anymore, on a rocky slope that had never quite performed the way the newer blocks did. "What kind of something?" she told him. "Reduced irrigation, ground cover between the rows, instead of bare dirt, deep wood chip mulch under the canopy, no more herbicide strips. Let the roots go looking for what they need instead of handing it to them." Emmett was quiet for a long moment. "Your husband tried that block every which way for 10 years, and it never did much." "He tried it, the way everybody tries everything," Odessa said. "More water, more fertilizer, more spray. I want to try less." Emmett looked at her the way a man looks at someone he respects but is not sure he understands. "It's your ground now," he said finally, which was as close to agreement as Emmett Kowalczyk ever came to anything. "Let me tell you about the Yakima Valley Growers Co-op, because it is the room where this story turns. Every Friday morning, the co-op on Wine Country Road filled up with growers picking up spray supplies and comparing notes over bad coffee from a machine by the parts counter. And the man who ran that counter, and in a lot of ways ran the conversation, was a fellow named Grady Fenn. Grady had sold ag chemicals and irrigation equipment in that valley for close to 30 years, ever since he'd taken over his father's supply business, and there was not a block of trees in 3 counties he couldn't tell you the history of. What variety, what rootstock, what year it went in, how it had yielded the last 5 seasons. He was not a cruel man. He was a confident one, the kind of confident that comes from being right often enough that you stop imagining you could be wrong. He had helped half the growers on that bench design their irrigation systems, Walton Barons included, and he had opinions about every acre in his territory, freely given whether anyone asked for them or not. Odessa had come into the co-op that April to order wood chips in bulk and a load of sainfoin and chicory seed for the ground cover, and Grady Fenn was behind the counter when she set the order slip down. And he read it, and he looked up at her with an expression somewhere between confusion and amusement. "You're seeding this down? In the orchard rows? Between the rows," Odessa said, "on the old block, and cutting the irrigation." He said it like he was reading a diagnosis off a chart. "By how much?" "We're starting at 30% less, working toward 50 over a few years if the trees can handle it." Grady Fenn laughed. It was not a mean laugh, not exactly, but it was the kind of laugh that assumes company, the kind that expects the room to join in, and 2 of the growers waiting at the parts counter did join in, chuckling into their coffee. "Odessa," he said, shaking his head, "this isn't dryland wheat country. These are Rome apples on M9 rootstock. You cut water 30% on M9 in August, and you're going to have fruit the size of golf balls and trees dropping leaves in July. Not if the soil's holding the water instead of shedding it," Odessa said. "Honey, I sold Walton that irrigation system myself. Best money he ever spent." Grady said it gently, almost kindly, the way you'd correct a child who had gotten something backwards. "I understand you've got your government soil papers, I do. But there's a difference between a test plot and a working orchard that's got to make payroll." He looked past her at the 2 men at the counter. 22 years testing other people's dirt, and now she's going to test her own on the good ground. He wasn't unkind about it. He just said it the way you'd state a fact everyone already agreed on, and the 2 growers laughed again, softer this time, and one of them said something about how the NRCS never had to worry about a bad bin count come September. Odessa did not argue. She paid for her order, and she loaded the wood chips and the seed, and she drove home. "Let me pause here and ask you something. Have you ever stood in a room and watched people you respect laugh at something they haven't actually examined? Not out of malice, out of reflex, because the laugh is easier than the question, and the question is, what if I've been wrong about something for 30 years? That was the laugh in the co-op that April morning. It followed her out to the truck. She did not let it follow her any further than that. Let me tell you about what she actually did, because the details matter. Odessa converted the 11-acre-old block that spring. Emmett and the crew broadcast the sainfoin and chicory mixed down every row in May, and by June there was a low green tangle growing between the trees where bare dirt used to be, deep-rooted plants that would pull moisture and nutrients up from 6 feet down and, when mowed, drop that biomass back onto the surface as organic matter. Under the trees themselves they laid 4 inches of wood chip mulch, delivered by the truckload from a tree service in Yakima that was happy to unload it for free rather than pay a tipping fee at the landfill. And she cut the drip irrigation on that block by 30% right at the start of the season, and then watched. The first year was not dramatic. The block yielded about what it had the year before. A little less, in fact, 26 bins to the acre against 28 the previous season, which Grady Fenn heard about at the co-op and mentioned to more than one grower as evidence that he'd been right. Odessa did not argue with that either. She measured what she could measure, She had Emmett dig soil pits in October and sent samples to the WSU Extension Lab, and the organic matter on the old block came back at 2.1%, up from 1.6 the year before. Not dramatic, but moving. She ran an infiltration test with a length of PVC pipe pounded into the ground and a stopwatch, pouring in a measured amount of water and timing how long it took to disappear. On the old block, water was soaking in at just under an inch an hour. On the conventional block next door, bare dirt, same soil type, it was closer to a third of an inch, most of it running off toward the drainage ditch before it ever reached 6 inches down. She wrote all of it in a notebook that lived on the kitchen counter next to the empty space where Walton's black binder used to sit, before she'd started keeping her own beside it. The second year, 2017, she expanded the reduced irrigation ground cover system to 22 acres, cutting into one of the newer Honeycrisp blocks, the one everyone in the valley agreed was the most sensitive, the most demanding, the least forgiving of any mistake. Emmett had reservations about that one. Honeycrisp doesn't forgive, he told her. You cut water on Honeycrisp and get it wrong, you lose the block. Then we do it carefully, Odessa said. We watch the trees, not the calendar. That was the shift, if you want to understand what she was actually doing differently. Every other block on that bench was irrigated by a timer on a schedule set at the start of the season and adjusted mostly for weather. Odessa started walking the ground cover blocks 3 times a week, with a soil probe and a set of pressure bomb readings on leaf samples, watering when the trees showed actual stress rather than when the calendar said to. Some weeks that meant more water than the schedule would have given. Most weeks, especially as the roots started going deeper into soil that could now hold what fell on it, it meant less. By the fall of 2017, the organic matter on the old block had climbed to 2.6%. The infiltration rate had nearly doubled again, and the yield gap had closed. 29 bins an acre against 30 on the conventional block, close enough that even Odessa admitted to Emmett it might just be a good year rather than proof of anything. What was not close was the water bill. The old block and the expanded Honeycrisp ground had used 40% less irrigation water than the conventional blocks, at a savings, once she ran the numbers with the district's tiered pricing, of just over $11,000 for the season on land that was yielding within a bin or two of everything around it. She showed Emmett the number in the notebook. He looked at it for a long moment. Your husband would have liked that number, he said. It was the closest thing to a compliment Emmett Kowalczyk had given her in 2 years, and Odessa found, standing there in the October orchard with the ledger open between them, that it meant more to her than she expected. Let me tell you about the summer that made this story, because the whole Pacific Northwest was about to prove Odessa Berenz's argument for her in a way no notebook ever could. In late June of 2021, a heat dome settled over the Pacific Northwest, a slow-moving high-pressure system that trapped hot air over Washington and Oregon and pushed temperatures to numbers the region had never recorded and had no real infrastructure to handle. In Yakima, the thermometer hit 111 degrees on the 28th of June and 113 the next day, and stayed above 100 for the better part of a week. It was, by every measure meteorologists could offer, a once-in-a-thousand-year event, arriving at the exact moment in the growing season, midsummer, fruit sizing on the tree, when apple orchards across the valley were most vulnerable to catastrophic heat and sun damage. What that heat did to an apple orchard, if you have never seen it, is not subtle. Direct sun exposure on fruit that has never had to develop its own defenses causes sunburn, a literal scald that turns the skin brown and leathery and renders the apple unsellable for fresh market. Trees under water stress in extreme heat shut down photosynthesis to conserve moisture, which halts fruit sizing entirely and can cause fruit drop severe enough to cost a grower a third of the crop in a single week. Growers across the valley ran their overhead cooling systems around the clock, spraying water over the canopies to try to knock a few degrees off leaf temperature, and many of them still watched blocks come through that heat wave with sunburn rates above 40%. Grady Fenn drove his territory that week, the way he did every summer, and what he saw on the conventional blocks, the bare dirt standard irrigation ground that made up most of the valley, including most of the Barrens acreage that Odessa had not yet converted, was ugly. Trees with leaves curling by mid-afternoon despite full irrigation, because the roots, shallow and lazy from years of precisely delivered drip water, simply couldn't keep up with demand that extreme. Fruit scalded on the sun-exposed side of nearly every row. The ground cover blocks were doing something different. Let me be careful here, because I don't want to overstate it. 2021 was brutal for everyone in that valley, Odessa Barrens included. Her converted acreage was not untouched by the heat, but it was measurably, dramatically better off. The wood chip mulch under the trees was keeping soil temperature at the root zone 10 to 15 degrees cooler than the bare dirt on the conventional blocks. According to the soil thermometers, Odessa had been logging twice a day since the heat wave started. The deeper root systems, developed over 5 years of being made to search for water, instead of having it delivered to the surface, were reaching moisture the shallow-rooted trees on conventional ground simply couldn't access. And the organic matter, now averaging just under 4% on the oldest converted block, was holding water in the root zone the way a sponge holds water, releasing it slowly instead of losing it to evaporation off bare, compacted dirt. When the packing house tallies came in that fall, the numbers told the story in a way no argument at a co-op counter ever could. The conventional blocks on the Barrens orchard came in with a sunburn and heat damage cull rate of 30%. Bad but close to the valley average, which was itself a disaster year for growers across the region. The converted ground cover blocks came in at 14%, 14. On a year when the entire Pacific Northwest tree fruit industry was reporting losses in the hundreds of millions of dollars, the 62 acres Odessa Barrens had spent 5 years converting had lost less than half of what everything around it lost, on less than half the water. Let me tell you about the afternoon Grady Fenn drove up the gravel road to the Barrens place, because it is the moment this story has been building toward since that laugh in the co-op. He came in his white supply truck with the fertilizer company's logo on the door, the same truck he'd driven up that road for 30 years, and he found Odessa in the equipment shed, the same shed where Walton had died 6 years earlier, going through irrigation valves with Emmett for the following season. Grady stood in the doorway for a moment with his hands in his jacket pockets before he said anything, and when he did speak, he had the look of a man who had rehearsed the sentence more than once on the drive over and still wasn't sure he had it right. "Odessa, you got a minute?" She set down the valve she was holding. "Sure, Grady. I've been hearing things," he said, "about your cull rates, about what the co-op's hearing from the packing house on your blocks versus everybody else's."
"What have you been hearing?"
"That you came in at 14% heat damage on the converted ground, that the rest of the valley's closer to 40. He looked at the floor of the shed, at a coil of drip tubing hanging on the wall that he himself had sold Walton Barrens 20 years before. "I've got growers calling my office asking what they should be doing different after this summer, and for the first time in about 30 years, I don't have a good answer for them." Odessa looked at him for a moment. She thought about saying nothing, about simply telling him what she'd done and letting that be the end of it. But 5 years is a long time to carry a laugh in your chest without setting it down somewhere. "Grady," she said, "do you remember what you said to me at the counter the spring I put the seed order in?" He had the decency not to look away. "I remember. You said this wasn't dryland wheat country. You said Rome apples on M9 rootstock couldn't take 30% less water. You told two other growers in front of me that I was going to lose the good ground trying to prove a point." She said it evenly, without heat, the way you recite something you've had a long time to make peace with. "I was 51 years old, and I'd spent 22 years testing soil in this valley for a living, and you laughed at me in your own store." "I know," Grady said. "I'm not telling you that to make you feel bad about it," she said. "I'm telling you because the lesson isn't that ground cover is magic, or that cutting water is always right. The lesson is that an orchard that's only ever been managed one way is an orchard that only knows how to survive one kind of summer. And we're not going to get many more of the kind of summer this valley was built for. I'll put together what I've got: the infiltration numbers, the soil temperature logs, the cull rates by block. Bring whoever wants to see it out here in the spring, and I'll walk the ground with them." Grady nodded slowly. "I'd appreciate that." He stood there a moment longer, like there was something else he wanted to say. And then he settled for, "Walton would have been proud of what you did with this place," which was not quite an apology, and was also, somehow, exactly the right thing to say. And he put his cap back on and walked out to his truck. Let me tell you what happened in the years that followed, because the story doesn't end in that equipment shed. By 2023, 9 other orchards on the Cowich Bench had converted at least a portion of their acreage to some version of what Odessa had built: reduced irrigation guided by plant stress readings instead of a calendar, deep mulch under the canopy, perennial ground cover between the rows instead of bare, sprayed dirt. The results varied. Ground cover is not a formula you can copy exactly. It's a practice that has to be adjusted to soil type and rootstock and microclimate. And some growers who tried to convert too much acreage too fast lost fruit their first year and had to scale back and relearn it slower. But the direction held. Organic matter climbing, water bills falling, and every one of the converted blocks came through the 2 more heat events the valley saw over the following 3 summers in noticeably better shape than the conventional ground around them. Odessa herself converted the rest of the Barron's Orchard by 2024, block by block, over Emmett's initial caution and eventual full agreement. She was invited to speak at the Washington State Tree Fruit Association's winter meeting in Wenatchee that year, standing at a podium in a hotel ballroom in front of nearly 300 growers and extension agents, most of whom had spent their careers doing things the way the valley had always done them. She put up 8 years of data: organic matter, infiltration rates, water use, cull rates as through the 21 heat dome, and she told them what she had told Grady Fenn in the equipment shed: that an orchard managed only one way is an orchard that has bet everything on the weather staying the way it used to be, and that the soil itself will tell a grower what it needs, if the grower is willing to walk the rows often enough to listen. When she finished, Grady Fenn, sitting in the 4th row because he had come at his own expense to hear her, was the first one on his feet. Let me tell you about one last thing, because it's the part of this story that matters most. In the spring of 2024, Odessa's niece, Delia Aldous, 26 years old and just finished with a master's degree in agroecology at Oryx State, drove up from Corvallis with a folder of research on silvopasture, the practice of running sheep through orchard rows to graze the ground, trim it naturally instead of mowing it, and add manure and hoof action to the soil biology instead of diesel exhaust. She spread the printouts across the kitchen table, the same table where Odessa had once spread her own notebook next to Walton's black binder, and she said, "I want to try something on the Honeycrisp block." Odessa looked at the papers. She looked at her niece, and she did not say she needed to think about it. She did not offer Delia the smallest, least productive corner of the orchard as a place to fail safely. She said, "How many head do you want to start with?" That was what the notebook had always been for. Not just to prove she'd been right, to make sure that the next time someone in that kitchen had an idea nobody else in the valley had thought to try, there would be no laugh waiting for them at the co-op counter. Only a table cleared off, and room enough to spread the papers out.